Okay, how's it going? This week, I was really interested in seeing these two topics side by side, mainly the ethics of eating and Nietzsche's Superman. So today we're going to go over an interesting way of how these two interact, look at the potential speciesism running through the history of the philosophies that we've studied so far, and at the end I'm going to ask kind of the big question that I like the most out of both of these topics and get us thinking imaginatively about our possible futures. Okay, so first, I wanted to emphasize that when we look at the ethics of eating, this is the first one of the big questions about species. How do we interact with other species? And I think it's interesting that we haven't even really gotten to this question yet in a traditional ethics course, especially considering that our existence is kind of in a lot of ways dependent upon other species, not just our dogs and our cats for our emotional health, but the food that we eat. And in a lot of what I wanted to discuss in terms or connect this to is Native American philosophy, which we also have not studied traditionally in the ethics class offered in American universities, particularly the idea of mitake u oyasin. I think I'm saying that as close as I can, Lakota, which means all my relations, or the sense that our ethics have to do with everything that we're related to. We are what we eat, and then what eats us. In fact, a very cool in Nahua philosophy, in Nahua philosophy, we have this idea that we eat of the earth, and then the earth eats us. So our being human is a process of consuming and then being consumed. In fact, in an ethical system in this way, where is way more ecological, it's about the ecology. So we should probably actually put that up here. How do we interact with our ecology? What does it mean if we're talking in Nahua terms of providing a good meal for the earth? Incidentally, soil does really like blood and bones. Just interesting side note there. But I digress. The point that what I wanted to make, why I like this idea of ethics of eating, is that eating is one of the ways that we interact with other species that are not human. So this idea of all my relations is connected to all of the different species we interact with, but also this is about ecology and the environment. This is the little bit we're doing on environmental ethics, which is also kind of really a sad mistake that I should probably take responsibility for in the design of this course, that we've only given one day to environmental concerns about the climate, concerns about pollution, concerns about how we interact with our world as a cornerstone, potentially foundation of ethical action. And I hope through this lens we can kind of see actually some of how anthropocentric and how narrow a lot of ethical ideas that we've been studying so far this semester really are, in the sense that virtue ethics is about becoming the greatest human being possible, and Aristotle writes a lot about our friendships and our interactions with other human beings, but not as much about our interaction with the earth. that the social contract, my goodness, doesn't even really talk about the environment in a sense that the environment doesn't get a vote in the social contract. The social contract is between human beings about human relationships, and the environment virtually never even gets in there at all. Utilitarianism, pain and pleasure. Who's measuring the pain or pleasure of the soil microbes upon which we depend for our sustenance? Well, maybe they should be included. We could probably actually measure soil microbe pain and pleasure based on how many of them are surviving or not, based on how we use the fields. Interesting side note, I heard last week that in traditional Jewish communities, they thought that the earth needed a Sabbath day as well. So they would plant 6 years and then in a field, and then they would let the fields lay fallow for a year to give the land time to recuperate, because the land, like us, needs a Sabbath. I think that's great, and it points right at this big question of how much does ecology and environment impact what it means to be ethical or not. And I'm going to kind of argue that it means a lot, especially in the coronavirus COVID-19 situation, that we're seeing partially our diet and our eating, which is linked to the political infrastructure of our country and the way we structure our farm bill and our farm subsidies to prioritize certain kinds of calories that don't make us healthy. This has to do with these giant social constructs as well. Which always comes up when we have this discussion, I should just say, about the ethics of eating. It's more expensive in terms of time or money to eat better. Farmers markets are fantastic. Helps you eat locally, but they're more expensive. Organic is better because it reduces pesticides, but it's more expensive. Fresh foods and vegetables are great to eat for your health and therefore for your energy. But they can be more expensive, or they're more time intensive to consume and prepare, which points to the political and social realities of this dilemma and this debate that really interestingly tie in to this question. Ethics of care fits in here really well. I think one of the most caring things we can do for someone is cook them a meal. How do we do that? And it just seems like a crazy big blind spot. The more I think about this in the history of Western philosophy, Kant, for crying out loud, the categorical imperative is about beings that are able to choose. And he does not give that moral authority to trees or nature in general, which might be a really big oversight and a giant glaring bad assumption, but I digress. I wanted to go over this, that the ethics of eating connects to all of the philosophies that we've studied insofar, and it also brings in a certain kind of Native American philosophy that we have not studied, insofar as it deals with the ecology, our environment, and our political and social systems that enable us to interact with our environment and our ecology. And that just seems super important from the standpoint of virtue ethics, what it means to be a good human being, the social contract, what it means to have good laws that protect our environment and our air for the life that needs it. For utilitarianism, in terms of pain and pleasure of all my relations, down to the microbes in our soil. Of Kant's idea, what kind of, maybe we should grant more beings the respect of inclusion in our moral sphere. I love all those questions. So I wanted to kind of make those clear since we didn't get to talk about it in class. And I wanted to kind of give you my perspective on this and some history of books to read in the order that I read them, that they had the influence on me. The first one is The Vegetarian Myth. I became a vegetarian for a while for ethical and political reasons, mainly, not political, ethical reasons, environmental reasons, looking at how much, resources required to create certain kind of meat products, and then looking at the living conditions in a lot of the meat farms. And this book, The Vegetarian Myth by Lierre Keith, love his first name, not Pierre, Lierre. This opened my mind to thinking about tofu. Great example. Where's tofu come from? Well, it's a soybean. Where's soy come from? Well, we plant it and harvest it. Under what conditions is the soy cultivated? In these giant monocrop agricultural fields that kill soil, like it just destroys soil and then spray a bunch of pesticides on it to make sure that only one thing grows in there, which is completely unnatural. Maybe that tofu isn't so good either. Or at least we need to really understand that to eat is to kill. And good killing, as it were, takes the whole environment into account, which is something we've lost sight with when we get our food from grocery stores, and it's interesting. Anyway, I have since, from reading this book, I'm no longer a vegetarian, but I tried to still eat less meat and to be careful about where the meat comes from, as realistic as that can be given my socio-political privilege and standing in the society. Okay, the other book that I really love on this is The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan, who is a Berkeley professor emeritus of journalism. And he, like a journalist, dissects 3 separate meals: a fast food meal and a home-cooked Whole Foods meal, if you will, like where you get everything at Whole Foods, and a meal where it's, they shot and killed the pig that they ate and basically made all the food from scratch. Anyway, it's a brilliant book, and it really raises this question of what does it mean to eat ethically, and how do we do that, and how does that connect with all our relations. It should also be noted before we move on that this is not just Native American philosophy, but that Buddhist philosophy, this is another way of saying what the Buddhists were saying. We're interconnected with everything else. That's what it means to be a self. We are naturally interconnected with everything else that's going on, and hence we want to act in a way that we don't harm any of them, because that harm comes back to us. We want to love all beings, so that love comes back to us in that kind of a sense. And Buddhists are generally soft, vegan, vegetarian types, because they're trying not to harm things, partially from the tradition in India where that's come from. Again, social political realities. Okay. I love how this connects the question of what do I eat and why do I eat it to Nietzsche's Superman. And this one we're going to do a lot quicker, because the idea here is that this is resurfacing for the last part of our course, the existential question of our ability to choose what and who we are at a very basic level. And this is the sense of meaning. So our final unit in the course is how we understand what the meaning of life is. So in a couple minutes I'll be able to answer that for you, like what is the meaning of life. But before that, we're going to think about it for a minute and see that actually meaning is a property of language. I'm not sure that dolphins question the meaning of life. They're too busy dolphining. We, however, as language, storytelling, metaphor making, meaning making, we partially are using language, and that language reflects a certain kind of will to power. And for Nietzsche, our job, social political systems, anyone? Our job is to define ourselves in a way that is authentic to us, i.e. honoring our unique position, I would say, in the ecology of things. And that in defining ourselves, ideally, making and doing the best job we can at being a human being, I think must relate to all of these other things, since we don't exist in isolation. It's astonishing to see how much of European philosophy acts as if we do, or at least doesn't seem to recognize or write about the environment in which we're in, which is another topic altogether. Point being, we're looking at Nietzsche's Superman not because we endorse what Nietzsche's saying. In fact, I want to push back against Nietzsche's Superman and remind you of Martin Luther King's natural law, the idea that a law is good if it lifts people up and bad if it brings people down. I also want to remind you of Kant's idea of the golden rule and the golden rule on steroids, or the idea of the humanitarian principle of act according to treat others as an end in themselves, never as a means only. So there could be these non-existential, i.e. truthful ideas that are completely separate from language that connect to our idea or our ability to live a good life. And this is the big question. What is the super you? I.e., if you imagined a super version of yourself, who is that? What are they like? Now, if we're going to take Aristotle's lead on this question, which I think is a good place to remember and go back to, your super version of yourself is less about the things you do and more about the kind of person you are. So super version of yourself is not really necessarily the job that you have, it's the kind of person that you are. It's the habits and the character that you have. What Nietzsche is saying is that we have a creative liberty and an obligation to understand and give our lives meaning. Aristotle would say that we have the opportunity as biological beings to express that nature to the best of our abilities. And I think it's worth really actually thinking about and writing about in your journal if you're keeping one. Can you imagine what the most highest, superest, best version of humanity would be? I imagine Gandalf. Kind of, actually. I would imagine a really diverse humanity, actually. Interesting. What's the super you like? And how much does it have to do with what you eat? Okay, for the last final weeks, we're going to be looking at this the meaning of life question and how that connects to ethics. I hope this big overview of the ethics of eating and Nietzsche's Superman, the idea of an exemplary person that's able to choose who and what they are and provide themselves meaning despite the language, political, social power that is imposing on them. Cool. See ya. Put your questions below if you have them.